My brother introduced me as the family failure at his engagement party while I served drinks. Then his fiancée looked up from her phone and whispered, "Is this you on Forbes?" The Fairmont's ballroom glittered like something built specifically to make ordinary people feel small. Crystal chandeliers threw light across the marble floor in long, shifting bars. Orchids, actual orchids, flown in from Thailand, according to the place cards I'd helped arrange 3 hours earlier, sat in tall glass vases at the center of every table. A string quartet played something by Vivaldi in the corner, and 200 guests in silk and tuxedos drifted between conversations about yacht refits, Harvard legacy admissions, and which Aspen Ski and Chalet was, this season, the only one worth being seen at. This was David's engagement party, my brother, the golden child, exactly as advertised, in a tuxedo that fit him the way tuxedos only fit people who've been measured for one since they were 12. I stood near the catering station in a plain black dress and a pair of discount flats I'd bought at a strip mall in Cambridge, refilling champagne glasses because the servers were busy and somebody had to do it, and apparently that somebody was me. Nobody questioned it. I don't think anyone in that room had looked at me directly all evening. At 10 o'clock, David tapped his glass with a spoon. The room quieted. The particular, practiced quiet of people who've all attended 1,000 parties exactly like this one, and know precisely how long to wait before the speeches start. He stood under the chandelier with Victoria, his fiancée, 28, glowing, every detail of her curated down to the way her engagement ring caught the light at exactly the angle that made it look largest. "I'd like to introduce a few family members," David said, scanning the crowd with the easy confidence of a man who had never once, in 36 years, doubted that a room belonged to him. His eyes landed on me, and I saw it, that smile, the one I'd known since I was 7 years old, the one that always arrived right before something humiliating. Victoria, Richard, Eleanor, he gestured toward me, raising his glass. "Meet my sister, Sophia." He paused, just long enough for the room to look. "Meet the family failure." The laughter came instantly. A ripple, then a wave. The kind of laughter that happens not because something is actually funny, but because 200 people have collectively decided that laughing is the safest response to whatever just happened, and nobody wants to be the one who doesn't. "She's been exploring her options for years," David continued, warming to it now, the way he always did once he had an audience. "Still figuring out what she wants to be when she grows up." More laughter. "Someone near the ice sculpture covered her mouth with a napkin. Living in some tiny apartment downtown. Consulting here and there. Nothing too conventional. That area is very transitional," said Eleanor Payton, Victoria's mother, 60-something, in a dress that probably cost more than my actual rent, said it gently. The careful gentleness people use when discussing a charity case in front of the charity case. My mother chimed in from somewhere to my left. "She's the artistic type, idealistic." My father added in the patient, slightly weary tone he'd perfected over 35 years of introducing me as a problem to be managed. "We've offered to help her find something more stable. Accounting, HR. David has connections, you know, despite her background. Despite." I stood there holding an empty serving tray while 200 strangers in formal wear discussed me like a structural defect in an otherwise excellent house. "The thing is," David said, and his hand landed on my shoulder, warm, heavy, the exact weight of every time he'd ever put me in my place at a family dinner. "Sophia's always thought she'd be special somehow. Meanwhile, the rest of us are out here actually building careers. Maybe she'll figure it out," Victoria added, not unkindly, scrolling absently on her phone with her free hand. "Some people are just late bloomers." I set the tray down on the linen-covered table beside me. The clink of metal against the tablecloth was sharper than I expected, sharp enough that 2 or 3 nearby conversations paused. "That's an interesting introduction," I said. The circle around David quieted. He laughed, a short, nervous sound, nothing like the warm performance from 30 seconds earlier. "Come on, Soph, don't be sensitive, it's family. You can move your hand," I said. He did, slowly. I felt several pairs of eyes track the movement, the way people watch something they can't quite name yet but already sense is wrong. David recovered fast. He always did, that was always his gift, and launched back into wedding plans. Monaco, a yacht. The Hotel de Paris, where apparently the honeymoon suite had the best views of the harbor, hands down. Victoria, beside him, had gone quiet. She was still looking at her phone, scrolling, and then she stopped scrolling. I watched her face change. The color actually drained from her cheeks, the way it does in movies and almost never does in real life, except apparently when it does. "Sophia," she said quietly. David kept talking, something about catering options for 200 guests on the Côte d'Azur. He didn't hear her. "Is this you?" She turned the screen toward me. The Forbes cover had gone live that morning. I'd known it was coming. I'd approved the photo 3 weeks earlier, but I hadn't expected to be standing in a ballroom holding a champagne tray when 200 people found out at the same time I did. Me, in a charcoal suit, the Boston skyline behind me, arms crossed, looking exactly like someone who had absolutely nothing left to prove, and had simply decided that morning to stop hiding it. The disruption queen. How Sophia Martinez built a $3.2 billion AI empire in secret. The silence that followed felt like someone had cut the power to the entire building. "That's not," David started. He stopped, because it was. "My name is Sophia Martinez. I'm 35. And for most of my adult life, my family believed I was, at best, a disappointment, and at worst, a cautionary tale they brought up at dinner parties when they wanted to make David look good by comparison. I grew up in Wellesley, Wellesley, the younger of 2 kids, in a house where success had a very specific shape: prep school, an Ivy League degree, a respectable career, law, medicine, finance, something with a title that meant something at a cocktail party. David fit that shape perfectly. Harvard undergrad, Wharton MBA, a job at a private equity firm by 26. He was, from the time I can remember, the proof of concept for everything our parents believed about how a life was supposed to go. I didn't fit the shape. I went to MIT, fine on paper, except I dropped out after my sophomore year to work on something I couldn't fully explain to my parents at the time, because honestly, I couldn't fully explain it to myself yet. It was a research project, originally, an approach to applying early machine learning techniques to materials science problems, the kind of thing that sounds, to someone outside the field, like nothing at all, and to the 11 people in the field who understood it, sounded like the beginning of something enormous. I spent the next 11 years building it, quietly, under a holding company with a name boring enough that nobody ever asked about it twice, QS Holdings LLC, because I'd learned early on that the moment people knew what you were building, they wanted a piece of it, an opinion about it, or both. My family knew none of this. What they knew was Sophia dropped out of MIT. Sophia does consulting. Sophia lives in a small apartment and takes the bus and doesn't come to enough family events because she's busy with her little projects. The truth, the part I never told them, for 3 years, at every single family dinner, was that by the time I was 30, Quantum Solutions had 43 Fortune 500 clients and contracts with 12 federal agencies, doing work in AI-driven materials, discovery, and diagnostics that, as of that morning's Forbes article, had been independently valued at $3. $2 billion, though, and this part mattered later, the real number, the one only my board and 3 investment banks actually knew, was closer to $6 billion. The small apartment downtown was the top 2 floors of a converted textile mill in Fort Point, with a private elevator and views of the harbor that, ironically, were probably better than the ones David kept describing at the Hotel de Paris. The bus, that part was true for years, because I genuinely didn't want a driver following me around while I was trying to build something in private, and because, frankly, the 7 bus from Fort Point to South Station was faster than traffic most mornings anyway. I'd tried to tell them, 3 times actually, over 3 years: Thanksgiving, my father's 60th birthday, and once, just the 2 of us, my mother and me, over coffee, when I'd gotten as far as, "I've been working on something I think is actually going pretty well," before she'd patted my hand and said, "That's nice, sweetheart, but have you thought any more about what David mentioned, the analyst position? It's not too late to build something real." After that, I stopped trying, not out of spite, just exhaustion, I think. The specific exhaustion of realizing that the story they'd written about you is more comfortable for them than whatever the truth turns out to be, and that no amount of evidence is going to compete with a story someone's been telling for 30 years. About 18 months before the engagement party, my father almost found out, and I almost let him. Quantum Solutions had just closed a Series D round, led by a firm called Briarcliff Capital, and the announcement made the Boston Business Journal, not Forbes-level visibility, but enough that a few people in my father's professional circle, lawyers and accountants who actually read industry press, might have seen it. I came home for my father's birthday dinner that year half expecting someone to mention it. Nobody did. I sat through 3 hours of David recounting a deal he'd closed at the PE firm. Nothing crazy, just a $40 million add-on acquisition, but it's a good signal for my trajectory there. And I sat with the knowledge that the round I'd just closed was 11 times that size and said nothing. I told myself, it's his birthday. It's not the moment. There'll be a better time. There's always a better time when you're avoiding something. That's the whole trick of it. On the drive home that night, I got a text from my COO, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Priya Anand, who'd been with me since year 3 and was one of maybe 6 people who knew the full picture of what Quantum Solutions actually was. Briarcliff just sent the signed term sheet over. We're official. Congrats, boss. 11 years. I sat in my car outside my parents' house for almost 20 minutes after that text. Engine off, just sitting there. My hands weren't shaking. Not yet. I think what I felt was closer to grief. Grief for a version of that birthday dinner that could have happened, where I told them, and they were proud, and it didn't require a magazine cover for them to believe me. I drove home. I didn't tell anyone. I told myself it didn't matter. About 8 months later, Quantum Solutions acquired MedTech Industries, a diagnostics company based in San Diego, $8 billion, paid entirely in cash, which in my world was a fairly big deal. The kind of acquisition that gets written up in Stat News and Fierce Biotech, and occasionally, depending on the news cycle, picked up by general business press. The day the deal closed, I was in San Diego for the signing. A long day of lawyers, a notary, a conference room with too much coffee and not enough windows. Around 4 p.m., in the middle of it, my phone buzzed with a text from my mother. "Hi, sweetheart. Are you free this weekend? David and Victoria are coming for dinner Saturday. Would love if you could join. Maybe wear something a little nicer than last time. Just thinking of photos for the engagement announcement. Love you." I read that text sitting in a conference room where I had, 90 minutes earlier, signed the largest acquisition of my career, a deal that, according to the MedTech CEO who shook my hand afterward, is going to change how early cancer detection works for about 40 million people a year. And the message I received from my own family was a note about wearing something nicer for photos. I remember laughing, not a happy laugh, the kind that comes out involuntarily, almost like a cough when something is too absurd to process any any other way. Priya, sitting next to me, glanced over. Everything okay? Yeah, I said. Family stuff. I went to that dinner Saturday. I wore something nicer. Nobody asked me a single question about my week. 4 months before the engagement party, I was in Washington, D.C. For 2 days, a closed-door briefing with representatives from the Department of Defense and the National Institutes of Health regarding Quantum Solutions' work on AI-assisted materials research for next-generation battery storage, and separately, diagnostic imaging tools. It was, by a wide margin, the most significant set of meetings I'd had that year. The kind of room where the people across the table from you have security clearances that make your own NDAs look like a permission slip. On the flight home, I had a missed call from my father. No voicemail, just a text. An hour later, your mother and I are worried about you. David mentioned you seemed distant at dinner last month. Are you doing okay, financially? You know we're happy to help if things are tight. No judgment, no judgment. I sat on that plane, somewhere over Pennsylvania, holding a phone that 2 hours earlier had been turned off and physically locked in a secured pouch because of where I'd been and who I'd been talking to. And I read a message from my father offering to help with my finances because I'd seemed distant. My hands were shaking by the time I finished reading it, not from sadness exactly. From the specific vertigo of living 2 entirely separate lives that had become so far apart, they no longer seemed to share a single timeline. In one life, I was sitting across from people who reported, eventually, to the Secretary of Defense. In the other, I was a financial liability my parents quietly worried about. I typed out a response 3 different times. Dad, I need to tell you something. It's actually going really well. Better than well. I deleted all 3 drafts. I told myself, the engagement party is coming up. Maybe that's the moment. A bigger setting, more people. Maybe it'll be easier with witnesses. I had no idea, writing that thought on a plane somewhere over Pennsylvania, how literally that would turn out to be true, or how little control I'd ultimately have over the timing. 3 weeks before the party, I got a call from a journalist named Marcus Webb, a senior staff writer at Forbes, credentialed, the kind of byline that meant something in business circles. He'd been working on a feature about underrepresented founders in deep tech for almost a year, and Quantum Solutions had come up, he said, more than once from sources I can't name, as a company that's clearly enormous and somehow has almost no public profile. That's rare. Usually that means either fraud or, more often in my experience, someone who's been actively avoiding attention. Which one is it, Ms. Martinez? I liked him immediately, which surprised me. We talked for almost 2 hours. I agreed to the profile, partly because Priya and our board had been telling me, gently but consistently, for over a year, that the lack of public profile was starting to become its own liability, something competitors and even some partners had started to read as evasiveness rather than discretion. When would this run? I asked. We're targeting a cover for next month, Marcus said. I'll need a photo shoot. Give my team a week's notice for that. Other than that, it's mostly just living your life. We'll do our own reporting on the business side. I gave them a date for the photo shoot. I didn't think at the time to ask exactly which week the issue would publish, and by the time I found out, it was already locked, already in production, already scheduled for a Friday morning that I had not realized, until I checked my calendar 3 days before, was the same week as David's engagement party. I thought about asking Forbes to push it. I actually drafted the email to Marcus's editor. Then I stopped, and I thought about every dinner, every birthday, every no-judgment text, every time my own family had stood in a room and decided, collectively, what I was. And I closed the email without sending it. I told myself, let it run. Whatever happens, happens. I had absolutely no idea how literally that sentence would play out. 3 days later, under a chandelier at the Fairmont, back in the ballroom, the silence had a texture to it, the specific suspended quality of a room full of people simultaneously recalculating everything they thought they understood about the last 10 minutes. That's not, David had started and stopped. Victoria, holding her phone with both hands now, read aloud, her voice doing something I'd never heard from her before, a kind of careful, deliberate steadiness, like she was reading evidence in a courtroom and didn't want to mispronounce anything. Founder and CEO of Quantum Solutions, net worth estimated at $4.7 billion. Somewhere behind me, I heard a champagne glass slip from someone's hand and shatter against the marble floor. Nobody moved to clean it up. Richard Payton, Victoria's father, 62, the kind of man whose entire posture communicated generational wealth without him ever needing to say a word, had gone very still. I watched something shift in his face, in real time. The relaxed, almost bored confidence of old money politely tolerating new money, replaced first by recognition, and then, unmistakably, by alarm. Sophia, he said carefully, in a tone completely different from anything he'd used toward me all evening. Is this accurate? I looked around the circle, at the dozen phones that had been recording my brother's introduction 30 seconds earlier, still recording, except now angled differently, capturing something none of their owners had expected. At David, whose confidence had drained out of his face so completely that he looked, for the first time since I was a child, genuinely younger than me. Yes, I said, it's accurate. There's an article here about a $8 billion acquisition, Victoria said, her voice quieter now, almost careful. It says you bought MedTech Industries. In cash? Yes, I said. We're integrating their diagnostic research with our AI development. The early detection potential is significant. That's the work I was in San Diego for, the day my mother texted me about wearing something nicer for photos. I hadn't meant to say that last part out loud. It came out anyway. My mother's face changed, not anger. longer, exactly. Something closer to a kind of vertigo, the look of someone trying to physically rearrange a memory while it's still happening. "But you live in that tiny apartment," my mother said, stepping forward, one hand pressed to her chest. "You take the bus." "I live simply," I said, "by choice. The apartment is the top 2 floors of a converted mill building with a private elevator. I bought the whole building 4 years ago. The bus was real for years. I liked the anonymity. Privacy mattered more to me than being believed." My father's face had gone properly pale now. Not the social discomfort from earlier, but something deeper. The look of a man doing rapid math on 35 years of conversations and not liking any of the totals. "Sophia," he said, "why didn't you tell us?" "I tried," I said. "I kept my voice level. Not cold, just level. The way you'd state something you'd made peace with a long time ago, and were only now saying out loud. For 3 years. Every dinner, every birthday, every time you told me to get serious about my future, to consider accounting, HR, something stable, despite my background. Nobody spoke. We didn't understand," my mother said quietly. "You didn't want to understand," I said. "Understanding would have required believing, even a little, that I might be capable of something significant. And that wasn't a story anyone in this family had room for. There was already a story about which of us was the success. I just didn't fit in it." Richard Payton recovered fastest. "Men like him always do, I've found, in business and otherwise. Your quantum computing work," he said, his tone shifting again, this time into something I recognized immediately, because I'd heard it 100 times from investors, board members, government officials, the sound of someone realizing they're talking to a person who matters. The article mentions government agencies, Fortune 500 clients, 43 Fortune 500 clients, I said, 12 federal agencies. The Forbes valuation is conservative. It's based on our last priced round, which closed 14 months ago. The real number, as of our most recent internal valuation, is closer to 6 billion. 6 billion. 6. The number moved through the crowd almost physically. I watched it travel, table to table, in whispers and turned heads and the particular ripple of 200 phones being raised again, except this time not to record my humiliation, to record whatever this was instead. David stood frozen, mouth slightly open, an unfinished denial still hanging somewhere behind his teeth, going nowhere. I picked up the empty serving tray one last time and set it down, gently, beside his untouched champagne glass. "Congratulations on your engagement, David," I said. I turned and walked toward the exit, past the orchids flown in from Thailand, past the ice sculpture slowly weeping onto its silver tray, past 200 people in the middle of rearranging everything they thought they knew about the woman who'd spent the evening refilling their glasses. Behind me, I heard Victoria's voice, quiet and very certain, in a way that I think, more than anything else that happened that night, told me everything I needed to know about how the rest of David's life was about to go. "David," she said, "is this you on Forbes?" The laughter never started again. I want to be honest. I didn't orchestrate what came next. I didn't need to. I'd spent 11 years building something real, quietly, and the only thing that changed that night was that the rest of the world found out at the same moment my family did. What happened afterward wasn't revenge. It was just gravity, finally allowed to work the way it had been the whole time. Marcus Webb's Forbes profile, which had already been finalized and scheduled before that night, ran exactly as planned 3 days later, but the engagement party story leaked separately, almost immediately, through guests who'd been recording. A clip of David's "Meet the Family Failure" toast, juxtaposed against Victoria reading the Forbes headline aloud, was picked up by a business and culture account on social media within 48 hours, and viewed, according to a follow-up email from Marcus, more times in a week than almost anything else I've written has ever gotten in a year. He apologized for the timing. "I had no idea, Sophia, I promise," and I told him honestly that he had nothing to apologize for. The timing wasn't his to control. It never really had been anyone's, except, in the end, mine. Richard Payton, it turned out, sat on the board of a mid-sized asset management firm that Priya discovered doing what she called a little light due diligence, since apparently we're related to these people now, had 18 months earlier declined to pursue a partnership with Quantum Solutions on the recommendation of an analyst who'd written in an internal memo Priya somehow obtained a copy of that the company was likely overvalued, founder profile unclear, recommend pass. That analyst, as it happened, was David. I want to be clear, I never asked anyone to look into that. Priya brought it to me almost gleefully, the way you'd bring someone a particularly satisfying piece of gossip, and I told her, honestly, that I didn't need to do anything with it. The information itself was the consequence. David had spent 2 years building his career, in part, on the quiet confidence of having passed on a company that, it turned out, he'd been related to the entire time, and had recommended against for reasons that, in hindsight, said a great deal more about him than about us. He resigned from the PE firm 4 months later. I don't know the exact internal reasoning. Priya's sources suggested it was mutual, which in finance usually means exactly what you'd think, but I do know that recommend pass on a company later valued at $6 billion, written by an analyst whose own sister turned out to be the founder, is not the kind of memo that ages well in an industry built almost entirely on reputation. Victoria, for her part, called me about a week after the party. Not David, never David, not once. She apologized, genuinely, for the late bloomer comment, which she said she'd thought about more than I'd like to admit in the days since. We've had coffee twice since then, just the two of us. I don't know know what's happening with the engagement, and I've been careful not to ask. That part isn't really my story to tell. My parents called the day after the party. I let it go to voicemail. They called again the next day, and the day after that. On the fourth day, I picked up. It was a long conversation. I won't reproduce all of it. Some things, I think, are allowed to stay between the people who said them. But my mother said something near the end that I've thought about often since. "We spent 30 years," she said, "deciding what kind of person you were based on what we wanted to be true about David. And the whole time, you were just waiting for us to ask." I didn't tell her it was okay. It wasn't, not entirely, and I think pretending otherwise would have been its own kind of dishonesty. But I told her I was willing to have dinner, a real one, not for photos. And we did a few weeks later, just the three of us. It was the first family dinner in 11 years where nobody asked me about accounting.